F1 is one of the easiest sports to follow and understand in comparison to any other sport. Don't believe me? Allow me to explain to you my story on how I went from being someone who knew absolutely nothing about the sport to becoming the avid F1 fan I am today. In this video, I'm going to share with you the steps that I took and that you can take to become a Formula 1 fan yourself. The best thing about this sport is you can get involved with it as much as you're willing to, whether that's consuming every bit of content around the sport or just watching what you need to follow what's happening in the season. The goal here is so that if ever you get yourself in a conversation about Formula 1, you're able to carry that conversation without a problem. So now with that aside, it's time to get into my story and the steps that I took to become the Formula 1 fan I am today. So let's take a quick trip back to the past. I was born in Montreal in 1996. My previous knowledge of F1 was Michael Schumacher, Lewis Hamilton, and the noise that the cars made every year that they came here. I had never been to a Grand Prix, and I've never watched a race on TV. So you might be asking, what change happened for me to suddenly become a Formula 1 fan? And that's actually a very important factor, because it's the person who introduced me to the sport. And that is, of course, the other half of this channel, Cass. Cass, do you want to come out here? Come on over. Say hello to everyone. I can credit her for my entire interest in this sport.
It's me.
Okay. Thanks. So we're taking it back now to 2017, where I was fortunate enough to get free tickets to the Grand Prix because of the internship I was working at. I decided it would be great to bring Cass along with me. I knew she was a fan of the sport and I was intrigued to see what it was all about. It was in fact one of our few first dates. It was a good time. She clearly knew so much more about it than I did, and I was just there to enjoy the race. But funny enough, after that race, I didn't actually watch any other race that season. Me and Cass started dating, and I remember sometimes she would just have the races open on her laptop and I would just be veering out of the corner of my eye. Heck, I remember at some points she would set an alarm at 2 a.m. to watch the Australian Grand Prix, and I thought she was nuts. Meanwhile, here now, I'm waking up at 5 a.m. just to watch the Russian Grand Prix. Oh, how times have changed. And in fact, it wasn't until the 2019 season where I decided I'm actually going to become a fan and follow the season more. This is where I took my first step in becoming a Formula 1 fan. I decided for that year I was going to pick a team and be a fan of only that team, which to be fair is a hard task to do considering I didn't have that much knowledge about the sport or the history of any of these teams. So if there are any of you out there right now in a similar position to as I was, I'm going to briefly go over for the newcomers how an F1 season works. An F1 season involves sometimes 17 to 23 different races. A race happens over the weekend and is broken down into 4 different dates. The most important day is the Sunday, as that is race day where all the points are on the line. The first 2 days on Thursday and Friday, those are just for media and for free practice for the car to get tuned up for the Saturday and Sunday. Saturday is qualifying, where all the cars have to race around the track as fast as they can, and whoever ends up getting the fastest time gets pole position, which is the person who gets to start at the front of the grid on race day. And of course, like I said, the most important day is race day, where the person who finishes in first place wins and gets the most amount of points. It works similar to a game of Mario Kart on the Nintendo. First place gets 25 points, and so on and so forth. With the top 10 positions scoring points, anything below that you get nothing. And the way the championship works is the driver who scores the most amount of points by the end of the season wins. But what's also fun about F1 is there's a whole other championship happening at the same time. So there are 10 different teams on the grid with 2 drivers each. And at the end of the season, they combine both of those 2 drivers' scores together, and those are their team points. So at the end of the year, there's going to be 1 driver to win and 1 team to win. But I think this is the key element that makes Formula 1 the easiest sport to follow. There are only 10 teams with 2 drivers each. When you look at some other sports like hockey, basketball, football, these sports could have teams with 30 players on it and maybe 30 teams in the league. That's a lot of names to know, especially when you have to remember which players are good or which ones struggle more. And this is what brings me back to my first step when becoming a Formula 1 fan, is to choose one of those 10 teams to be a fan of. Now you might be asking yourself, how do I make this decision without any previous knowledge of the sport? I don't want to make a bad decision. Well, there's a ton of information out there. You can look at past seasons to see how each team finished, or there's in fact a whole Netflix series online that shows exactly what's happened in each team in the past few years. Or you can take a much simpler and easy approach and do what I did, which was I chose the team that I wanted to cheer for based on their color. Yep, that's right. I just looked at the grid, saw all the cars, and I said, yes, that's the one I want to go for, and I based it all on looks. So in 2019, I picked McLaren. The bright orange stood out to me, and I saw them sort of as an underdog team at the time. I also knew they made really fast sports cars, so I was thinking I was making a good choice. So now that you've chosen your team, it's now time to see them in action at one of the races. You can look up online F1 races to see when the next one is for you. You're gonna set a reminder just before the race starts, and you're gonna try and watch it. So that's on this Sunday. Now, I'm not asking you to watch the full 2 hours when you're starting off as an F1 fan. I'm just asking you to watch the start and the first few laps of the race. It should only take no more than 30 minutes. The reason why I recommend watching the first few laps of the race is this is when a lot of the action happens. It's the time where the cars are closest to each other and anything can happen. You'll see where your team performed in qualifying and how they do at the start of the race. Once you're satisfied with the amount of racing that you've watched, make sure to just take note of where your drivers are at. If they're doing really well, maybe consider to continue to watch, or maybe check back after the race is over to see how they did. If they ended up doing crazy good, maybe you're gonna wanna watch back the rest of the race, or watch the race highlights that the F1 YouTube page posts after each race week. It's only about 7 minutes, so it's a great place to get a recap if you happen to miss out on a race one week. At this point, I'd recommend watching as many race starts as possible. That's what I did, and I started to get a better understanding of who the other drivers were on the grid, which ones were doing great, and which ones were struggling more. So after watching a few races, I decided it was time that I did some more research on the drivers behind my team. And I would recommend you to do the same. Heck, you're cheering for these drivers after all, so it's good to know who they are as people and what their racing history is, and to make sure that you still like them afterwards. So this might be where you want to max out your Formula 1 fanship, and that's okay. You're watching 30 minutes of racing each week, you're seeing how your team is doing versus the others, you're understanding who's winning the entire season, which teams are struggling, and that's perfect. And that's where I took my pause in 2019. One element I really liked about Formula 1 was that every race mattered, and your team is involved in every race even if they're struggling. Whereas in other sports, if your team is struggling, they might not even make it to the playoffs. Whereas here, they're always going to be involved in every race and have a chance to do really well at a certain race, but maybe not the best for the season as a whole. But now if you're saying, hey, Chris, I want to go even further, I'm loving this, I want to keep enhancing my knowledge in the sport, here's the next steps that I took when I was in your place. Next, I started to look outside of my own team and start understanding who the other drivers were on the grid and the other teams. The first driver I began to follow and have an interest in outside of my team was Daniel Ricciardo. And that might be because he's Cass's favorite driver, but he's definitely grown on me. After better understanding all the drivers on the grid, I started watching the races in full. And what's really fun about watching a race in its entirety is you can start to understand what's a good strategy move and what's a bad strategy move. When's a good time to pit, and also there's always that factor of unpredictability. Next thing you know, there might be a crash, someone might have a mechanical issue, and it changes up the entire race. And being able to witness those moments live is so exhilarating. And next, I started watching all of the qualifying sessions. It's only an extra hour on the Saturday, but it built up my anticipation for the Sunday as I get to see exactly how each driver got to where they're positioned on the starting grid. And sometimes the qualifying can be just as important as the race. At some tracks, getting pole position is essentially your ticket to the win, whereas at some tracks, pole position might actually not really matter as someone could pass you in the first turn. So this is usually where I would max myself out. I would just watch the qualifying session and the races in full. It's about 3 hours of my weekend, which I was comfortable with. And in fact, afterwards I'd actually even watch some of the post-race interviews. That way I can better understand who all the drivers are, see what they look like without their helmet on, and get to know a bit more of their personality. Next, I went a little crazy with my fandom and began to start learning all of the different team principals, who are essentially the coaches behind each team. Once again, there was only 10, so I didn't see this as much of a chore. Next thing you know, I started doing a little more research in the history books on which drivers were the greatest of all time, which races stood out as really good races in the history, and which tracks are better than others. At this point, I got a better understanding of who all these drivers were, their accomplishments, any politics happening in the past between teams, and of course team rivalries. And maybe you're getting to the point where you actually want to go see a race live in person, especially if you've never seen a Formula 1 car drive by you in person. It left me speechless. I was right next to the track and they go by so fast. If you thought that was enough, there's actually even more you can get yourself involved with in this sport. There's a whole F1 fantasy league that works like any other sports fantasy league. We have a whole video dedicated to explaining how that works, so you can check it out after this video. And if you're looking to watch even more during race week, you can watch the free practices. They're not the most exciting, but you never know, something crazy could always happen. And at this point, you might just be watching free practice to see the cars going around on track and hearing the commentators talk about the sport. You can even start a group chat with your friends that all follow the sport and have conversations about what's happening, driver changes, and you could also engage with different YouTube comment sections. F1 Twitter is another location as well. Overall, I'm just trying to tell you here, you can get involved with the sport as much as you want to, whether that's only watching the first half of the races and then the race highlights, or watching every bit of media surrounding the sport. The main takeaway here is that both people understand what's happening when watching and know where the season is going, who's winning, who's not doing so well, and are able to hold a conversation if ever it gets brought up. So you've now heard the steps that I took to progressively become the Formula 1 fan I am today, and why I think this sport is one of the easiest ones to follow. I now ask you, I'd love to read your stories on how you became a Formula 1 fan. Was it your parents, your friends, or was this video your starting point? And while you're at it, why not consider subscribing to this channel where we post new videos about the sport every week. I'd like to thank you all for watching. If you have enjoyed this video, you already know what to do. And with that, I hope to see you in the next video. See ya.